Welcome to another edition of the Best Business Minds, where we interview business leaders and academics that write thought-provoking books. I'm Marc Kramer, serial entrepreneur who consults with family businesses and entrepreneurs. Today, I want to welcome Jeff Butler, author of The Authentic Workplace. Jeff, welcome and Happy
Appreciate
New
it.
Year to you.
Of course. Wonderful to be here.
And wonderful to see all of the audience that is signed on today. Please tell us about your professional background before we talk about your book.
Yeah, my professional background started in UC Berkeley, where I studied computer science on there. In fact, I was training for the Olympics and gave that up for a computer science degree because it turns out that a Nike contract is less than a computer science or software engineering job when you graduate. So worked as an engineer, software engineer in Silicon Valley, a couple different startups along the way. And I started my first company at 23. But the reason why someone would say, why'd you start so young, is I really felt that in a role in the corporate world, I couldn't really fully push myself to the degree I thought I could say bring my own thing. Plus, I grew up in a household where both of my parents were building software companies. So at a very young age, and I talk about this in the book, I got to see firsthand at like 13, 12 years old, how do you actually run a company? But I didn't really know at the time. I was like, oh, this is what mom and dad do. But from there, I was able to absorb a lot. And then mid 20s, really started getting into organizational psychology. And from there, I gave TED Talks, spoke around the world, from Asia to Europe to the US. I'm in South America on there. And now I do what I preach, and I run my own company with about 12 employees right now, and we're growing. And I'm able to do the research, then also speak about it, but also try it out in my own company on there. Because it's one thing to be working in the university and academia and doing research, but it's another thing to actually try it out day to day in what you do on there.
And what was your Olympic sport?
So track and field was the sport. And I got into UC Berkeley as a decathlete, but I ended up switching over to discus because, the academic workload at UC Berkeley, which is crazy.
Wow. Well, congratulations that you got that far.
Well, I mean, I didn't make it to the Olympics at least, but I appreciate the compliment.
Well, we are thrilled to have you here. And so let's talk about your book. Why did you write this book?
Because I had this weird, eerie feeling about something that was happening in the corporate world, and I couldn't really put my finger on it. And I felt that it had something to do with authenticity. I approached it more from the standpoint of what is the convergence that I feel that's happening versus, authenticity is great, everyone should do it. The reason why I sort of headed on that path is I saw that there's both an influence in, say, leadership, management, sales, social media, all these different dimensions that were more asking for this sense of authenticity and increasingly amount. I said, why is that? What's happening there? It's such a bizarre thing because it might be just leadership's happening or just in sales, but it was all at the same time on there. And that's why I decided to put all those ideas into one book.
Well, I'd like you to tell us how you define authenticity.
Yeah, this is a weird thing for me because when people normally think about authenticity, they automatically think being yourself. But if you're in any sort of philosophy training and knowledge, you know that it's impossible because whenever you're in social circumstances, you have to sacrifice some part of yourself in order to be able to operate in that circumstance on there. So I actually split it up into 3 different dimensions based off of what the current society that we have interprets and perceives as authentic. So it's in several different ones. So the first one is essentially congruence. So you look at body language, how someone moves, acts, talks. Is that in line with what they're saying? Can you agree with that on there? For instance, if you're watching a politician and you say, you know what, they're saying one thing, but their body says another, that's being incongruent on there. So that's the first dimension. The second dimension on there is attunement on there. So with any context and conversation that you have, there are certain things you can and cannot say. For instance, if I start talking about childhood trauma on here, that's very deep on there, or some sort of existential issue. And when people talk about topics, they go shallow and deep on there. in different conversations, you have certain ranges of what you have in terms of conversations. Being attuned is knowing that range, and being able to go deeper in there is showing more of that vulnerability, right? So you have the attunement, you also have the congruent site, and the last one is vulnerability on there. And the vulnerability is more in the attunement range and going deeper on there. For instance, if I would start talking about how I emotionally felt about watching my parents go through the 2008 housing crisis and what that really impacted my life, that shows a low vulnerability because I'm going deeper on something than rather a shallow perspective. And I always felt that it was quite interesting that the English language would talk about subjects in terms of you're off topic, on topic, and also shallow and deep on there. So there's sort of like a three-dimensional space to it, which I found fascinating. So I try to take the intersection of all those three topics, and in that middle, if you hit all three, you appear as authentic.
Well, so let's dive a little deeper into it. You start by writing the book that no one can just be themselves. And what do you mean by that? And how does that impact a person professionally?
Yeah, I use I think I say in the book, the silly example that if you were actually yourself, you would have Tourette's in a sense. Like you would basically, anything that comes to your mind, you would automatically say. And that you can't necessarily be 100% you in there. You have to sacrifice some sort of part of you in order to operate effectively within society on there. How much of that is up to the individual on there. So, for instance, Mark, there's certain things that you can and cannot say here. There's certain things I can and cannot say here. And if we go too far out and say exactly what's on our minds, that might be who we are. You might come off as obnoxious or not necessarily the term of authentic as what I was going after in that.
I think that's what in 2016 drew people to Donald Trump is that they felt politicians were not authentic and plastic and regardless of how you feel about his politics or choices he makes or whatever. So why do followers find him to be very authentic and why do half the country embrace his style and the other half doesn't?
Well, I think that was also another reason why I wrote it back in 2016, that era, is because it's obviously you have someone who doesn't have a lot of political experience on there, at least in the conventional sense. We're not talking about his business sense or anything that
Right.
happens outside of that. But I, this is only my personal perspective on this. I believe that it was, if you can have someone who speaks their mind all the time, you know where they are positioned and where they stand. And one of the worst things that you can personally experience as someone is deception. And that happens a lot in politics. And I believe that part of the reason of voting him in was the being exhausted of the deception that was taking place, or at least not feeling like you could fully, you don't know where someone's mind is at as a politician on there. And with Trump, I felt that since he spoke so much from his mind, and even if it was crazy, like Rosie O'Donnell's the only person, like stuff like that, it's like it's what he's thinking. And I think if people can see that, they can at least might not like him, but they can at least find him semi in a weird way predictable on there. And if someone's predictable in a conversation, and they said that earlier, you know where they're going to head next. Well, it's kind of a weird way of promising Trump, but then you have to contrast that to who he was running against on there, right? And she wasn't exactly known to be consistent in her policies, which is a mark against her on that. So you had those kind of contrasting viewpoints on there.
Right, of course. So what's your thoughts on specificities or general ability across different cultures or socially constructed systems of behavior and beliefs?
In what context, though?
I'm thinking, from looking at this question that we have here, how is that different being authentic in different cultures? Because I think, when you take a look at Swedish culture, it's a lot more reserved. If you take a look at the Chinese culture, certainly there's no emotion being shown there. It's a weakness. So how do you show authenticity in different types of cultures?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is based off of the culture that you're within on there. And I mean, there's several ways you can take it. First off is probably the way that I framed this initially was from a Western perspective, obviously, because most of my experience is in a Western world on there. My team, I have pretty intercontinental. So I have Asian, very heavy my team, but also Latin America. I also date someone from Latin America, and the way that I convey authenticity to my girlfriend it's difficult because the way that she looks for it is slightly different on there. She requires a little bit more like emotional vulnerability on
Yeah.
my end, for lack of a better word, being romantic in your language. While in the Western culture, I'm not used to saying that you're the most important thing in me my entire life, or something deep like that. I'm like, oh God, that's so much. I do think though the same dimensions hold up, but they're based off of the constrictions of the culture that you're within and the current um, expectations within that culture on there. I don't think that it's just in within the Western culture that those three, I guess you can call them circles, will apply on there. I think it can apply cross culturally as well.
So, how does a leader use this in a positive way that permeates the company's culture to build a potential unicorn company that practically every entrepreneur hopes for? When you go out and raise money, you're hoping you're going to be a unicorn as well.
Right. Well, you can't necessarily say that every person who has an authentic leader is a unicorn on there. I think that there are certain things that this can help out with being a leader. For instance, trust is the big one on there. If people perceive you as authentic, they are more likely to trust you for obvious reasons. The way you can do that, and I literally just had this happen about 10 minutes before this call. I have a manager on my team who's trying to convey an important point on the team, basically an expectation. Hey, everyone here has to do X by this time on here. And she said, this is mandatory. And I said, hey, wait a minute here. Let's tie it into something a little bit more emotional on there. That means something more to the team and express that, right? And we added a why in there. And that why was basically the reason why we're adding this is because we want to ensure that everyone who is on this team can close more in the next quarter on there. Now you're tying it back to them, but you're also providing a little bit more context and vulnerability. Now, if you want to dial it one step further, you can say something along the lines of, I would really love to see everyone succeed this quarter, much so more so than the previous one, because COVID has been difficult for all of us. Because of this, we want to make a mandatory rule for this to happen because our sole core belief is that Y result will take place that will benefit everyone. So you see, you gradually can break it down deeper on there. And as a leader, and if you just say, here's what you have to do, don't ask questions, you don't necessarily get that buy-in from people on there. And they don't understand, why am I really fighting for this individual on there? But if you're able to bring in more of the vulnerability, but also being attuned to who you're communicating with, you can definitely win hearts over as a leader.
But the company you worked for, and you talk about this in the beginning of your book, there was a company you had worked for that went bankrupt, and they tried to come across as authentic.
Right.
What happened there? To give them a little bit of background,
Yeah.
and then why that
Sure.
didn't work out.
I worked for a company, you can look it up. It's called Syndeo, Sindeo. It was a digital mortgage company. It's all over the news of it actually going bankrupt. Essentially, we were going for our Series C funding on there. I think it was around like 10 million or $8 million we were trying to get funding for. And there was an all hands meeting. So everyone in the whole company met, the CEO and the directors were talking to it was around 50 employees. So it's not a small startup by any stretch of the imagination. And the question came up, how are we doing on money? And the CEO said, we have more than enough money. The next week, they missed their Series C funding, and the entire company basically had to fire everyone. Otherwise, they're going to file for bankruptcy. And they got basically acquired when there's only 3 or 4 people for the intellectual property. That hit me very hard when I remember him distinctively saying that, because as a leader, you basically lied in front of everyone and you weren't honest. Now, here's the thing where it gets a little bit tricky. And it's a very important point. Do you always tell people when you're very vulnerable in money? Depends, right? And I believe I bring this point up in the book is, well, if you tell everyone that money is really short, what if all of your employees leave?
Yeah, they panic.
Right?
Yeah.
Right. And there's that side of it. So I don't think this is a black and white thing. I think it might have been a strategic decision, but then again, as a founder and as someone who has to make sure that everyone's being paid consistently, otherwise they'll leave, I would be very nervous if I had one last shot at raising the funds and running out of the, or basically knowing that if I don't make this, that the whole company's like over. When you have like 60 people, it was so that was a very interesting point in my career in Silicon Valley.
I think some people, especially entrepreneurs, always see the bright side and probably didn't tell people, hey, if we don't get this money, we go under, because they thoroughly believe that they can get that money and get over that hump and move it all forward. One of the questions we have here is trust in digital ecosystem. Are we missing some of the fundamental signals that build the subtle, not verbal, in-person dimension of trust?
So if I understand that question correctly, it's basically when we interact through the digital world, like how we are right now, are we
Yeah,
missing certain cues that we would normally be in person?
right.
Oh, 100%. I mean, do you think it's easier to present, like have this interview now versus everyone in the room? I mean, if it was everyone in the room, it would be completely different energy to it. And as a presenter, I can tell you first-handedly, like when you present, you're basically going into a monologue mode. You're talking with yourself on there, because what happens is when you have a feedback loop with someone, you say something, they react, and you can gauge that conversation whether or not you're actually connecting with them. And very often when you have the digital plane that we're in right now, you can't see that I have sweatpants on right now. I got a nice blazer on, but I have sweatpants, and like, how am I positioned? How am I feeling? And if I could see the whole audience react to the topics, I can definitely be able to tailor the content better. But unfortunately, I'm not able to. Even if people have their screens up, you wouldn't know if they're actually looking at playing solitaire or listening on there. So there's these different dimensions that I strongly believe, yes, we do miss in this medium.
I thought was very interesting. You talked about, and I've actually met him, Steve Jobs. I'm with you about Steve Jobs' management style. That, if it wasn't for Steve Wozniak and Tim Cook, probably we wouldn't even know who Steve Jobs was. But what did you find objectionable about his style, and how did he manage to succeed?
This is a matter of taste on there, but I believe that you can be very strong in your point without having to humiliate someone. And I
I said it was
believe,
going to be Shabbos.
hello?
Yeah,
Oh,
somebody I think accidentally forgot to turn
he was
off their
like, no,
mic.
I object. He did not. And I don't necessarily mean that he went around humiliating everyone. That's not what I'm trying to conclude here. I more mean that there are ways that you can really drive home a point very strong that you want to happen without having to lose your temper with people on there. And I I don't really like the conduct of trying to bully people or having like a lot of attitude in there. And instead of putting yourself above everyone, that you basically make yourself in a way equal emotionally. You're relating to someone one on one versus like, no, I'm way better. You have to do this because I'm the overall authority. I think there's a time and a place for that, but I don't think that should be your default mode on there, because what you start to do is, well, yes, you are. If you know what you're doing, yes, that's great for your ego, but at the same time, it's like at the end of the day, you're working with people on there.
Um, Regardless of how your grandfather and father were both entrepreneurs, how did their management styles influence you? And they came from different eras.
Right.
How did both manage to succeed?
Well,
I think that was a big part of what you studied.
yeah. And I didn't know when I was growing up. In fact, after the book, this is really bizarre, but after the book, I actually lived with my grandfather for about a year and a half on there. So I got a lot more closer to look of how he operated. So my grandfather, he was in the Navy on there. He grew up in Massachusetts in a house with six other siblings of about 800 square feet on there, basically poverty level. Had an alcoholic father who used to get drunk and beat the kids. That whole you know household issue. And he was more of your Steve Jobs type, but in a way of that he will do anything necessary to accomplish a job on there. He didn't care what was in his way. There's quite a brilliance to it, because you ultimately, the way he operates in terms of mindset is that anything can be accomplished. You already have the tools to, which is quite empowering. My father's had a lot more emotion, because I think since he grew up with my father, they were both in real estate. My grandfather was a developer. My father worked underneath him, and my father was at the tail end of, say, that fury or that drive on there. And my father became a lot more emotionally attuned to his surroundings, and for that reason had a much higher rate of retention with his employees. For instance, he's had some people who still work for my dad. I knew the first day on the job was when I was in high school, or my first like freshman year in high school on there, just to give you an idea. So it's over a decade. So my father learned from my grandfather on there on those ways of operating on there. I don't think either one of them had like my particular style, but I do think that each one can accomplish a goal, but in a different way.
And they ended up not working together, correct? They ended up,
Correct.
and is that because your father really wasn't comfortable with that style, that his style kind of evolved in more of a personal, get to know you, treat the employees in a different way style?
Yes and no. I think it was more of your typical arc that someone goes through in their life when they have to leave the nest, right? That he knew he had to become his own man beyond my grandfather. And in order for him to feel like he had a real um, place in the world, he had to develop his identity outside of my grandfather's. And when you have a very strong personality, it's sometimes very difficult to remove yourself from that environment on there when you have that authoritarian figure.
I also work with a lot of family businesses, and working with your parents is never an easy thing to go and do,
Oh yeah.
especially because your parents always forget that you're no longer a child,
Mhm.
and sometimes forget that you're an adult and give you the respect that they need to give you as an adult and treat you like an adult. And over time, as you mature in the business and equal, I was wondering about this. Are there any statistics for how well authentic environments do financially?
The thing is I don't believe you can break it down in that way because you have several different variables at hand. You have one, which is how you actually define authenticity, right? Because that can be the actual ability for the person to be authentic. But then again, how do you actually weigh that over a course of time on there? Because someone can be very authentic one day and not the next on there. Or is it that based off of a certain, let's say, sheet of authentic ways of acting, people score a certain level on there? As of right now, I don't know for sure, but I know that they have definitively shown with Gallup research and also research that Google's done that people are more engaged when they feel psychological safety. And people tend to feel more psychologically safe when the leaders are authentic because they're more consistent in their behavior and they can um, show outwardly that they're more trustworthy on there. So I think you can kind of do it from a correlation perspective, but I don't think, not that I know of, that someone sat down and say, okay, here's how we define authenticity. Here's how it works on the team. And then basically have an inauthentic leader and an authentic leader, and then seeing the actual difference. I don't think people have done that.
Yeah, and we've seen all types of leadership styles work. There's no one right way of doing it. From 1930 to 1990, CEO leadership styles were basically CEOs were kings with a mandate from God, but that's changed with technology flattening the world. What are the most effective leader styles today, and how do you see leadership evolving?
Well, I would have to disagree with you on that point of the leaders being somewhat like CEOs of godlike type and perceiving themselves as that, because there are a lot of people who were CEOs who were definitely brutal CEOs, of course. Um, but there are a lot of them that are out there that really would be willing to take out the trash if necessary. Ray Kroc was notoriously known to that. If he can see a McDonald's place that had trash in the parking lot, he would pick it up. And that's the CEO of the company on there. I think that maybe the characteristic you're trying to push forth here is more of an individual who tends to not puts themselves before in front of the people who they're leading on there. And maybe you're asking like, is that there's a change going forward with the leadership styles of today? Um, with that said, I believe that it's yes and no. I think sometimes in order to really drive results, you have to be someone that not everyone likes. That's just something I learned in business. It's tough, but not all of your employees are going to like you. You can make tough decisions, but ultimately you're going to hurt feelings, and how you go about it is up to the individual on there. Though I do think, in terms of an exterior perspective, that leaders are now more, especially if the company's large, they have to be more authentic and they're watched more carefully, because you have things like Glassdoor and social media that can just take an email from a CEO and post it on there. So you have to be a lot more careful. In fact, I have to sometimes watch in chat rooms if someone's saying something funny, and I'm like, oh, this would be a really funny joke that I'll mention to my friends, let me mention to an employee. I know that as a CEO, I am liable for that. And I cannot necessarily say certain things in that environment because that could happen on there. So I do think, though, part of that behavior becomes constricted in that sense.
Um, you write about the importance of developing a family atmosphere, uh, which your parents did, but do employees care about that today, or is it more about the money and quality of life?
Depends on the individual, right? I think there's some people who really look for a place that they can feel connected with people. For instance, Gallup research points out that if someone has more than, say, 5 friends in a workplace, they are 90% more likely to be engaged, for obvious reasons. You have people who you like, you're going to be more engaged in what you do. Though some people, and this is myself on there, I didn't give a crap about who was in the company. I just wanted to make money and accomplish things on there. When I didn't run my own company on there, and I was more into the financial side of things and my career development. But I know some individuals who, and I have a few in my company, that absolutely love the family atmosphere that we brought. That when someone has COVID or is going through a hard time, we have someone on our team who has cancer on there. Like, they'll talk and have that one-on-one time with them, and encourage them on their struggle. So I think it's variable going forward on that.
I think there's a different generation change. I think that people under the age of 21 to 35 want something different than I'm almost 60. And I think that a lot of people work with the idea of make as much money as you can, and you're going to be treated how you were going to be treated. But now, because literally the world is flat, and because of technology, you can work for anybody anywhere. You're not limited to just your geographic region for the most part, unless you're a delivery man or you're working for a dry cleaner. Even then, you've got other options of things that you could go and do. So I wondered about how this is changing over time with how people need to think about managing employees.
It does play an effect where, if the difficulty of acquiring a new job is less, it will make it more likely that people will leave the company. That's just a natural effect on there. You can look at the same thing as something like Tinder or Bumble, is that if you can just pull out your phone and get a brand new girlfriend or whatever, right, in a matter of days, what's the reason for you being there? And it could be a strong argument for why there's divorce rates so high if it's that much easier now. The same thing exists in companies where you can find so many jobs so quickly on there. And if you can't find one soon, just go ahead and rent a car and you can just do Lyft in the meantime on there, which then puts it makes it a lot more difficult to retain individuals on there, because it's so much easier for them to leave on there, which then the companies themselves are having to ask themselves the critical questions of, what do I have to do to make someone feel happy here? Now, what's bizarre about this is, and I don't discuss this in the book, this is something more I realized recently, we have currently a movement that talks a lot about people having to find their purpose within the workplace. I'm very against that, from the standpoint that I don't think the company is responsible for having someone find their purpose in life. I think they can be a valuable resource in helping them orient their life, but they're not the parent of the individual on there. And that's not up to, but we very often make the mistake of, I noticed this recently too. It's just a lot of companies say, well, we have to help people find what they want to do in life. It's like, look, a lot of people don't know what they want to do in life, and a lot of people aren't happy in their lives. And that's something like a responsibility of companies that their people are almost expecting the company to fill on there, which I think is quite difficult. But like in my company, I tell people, hey, like there's going to be a time when you join, there's a time when you leave. Nothing's permanent here. That's the true reality. And my goal is that this journey that you are on with me and the company, that it will be maximized and you will appreciate it when it's over, and you will somehow change for the better in that process on there.
Is it fair to say what you think is being authentic when you're managing your own people is just honesty and integrity? Honesty and integrity, and knowing that they're going to be respected. Is that the most important things in running an authentic company in your mind?
If people feel respected,
Yeah, I mean, is that what it really comes down to, is people needing to be respected?
it depends on how you define respected on there, because people feel that certain things that happen in their life defines that they're respected. I know some cases where I don't respect people. For instance, if someone joins the team and they want to negotiate for double their salary, but they haven't closed any business, you don't have that level of respect for me to have that conversation, right? You haven't, it's like, why would you? It's like, well, right. And I think as an individual, I think a byproduct of being authentic is that people feel respected, generally speaking. And this is more in the context of which I talked about in the book, not your true authentic nature of, like, say, Donald Trump, who would just say whatever's on his mind. Of course not. There's many people who don't feel like he respected them when he was acting in an authentic, quote unquote, way in that respect on there.
How do you maintain and build organizational culture and team cohesion in a remote environment?
It's different. And you have to be a lot more pragmatic about things, because the usual glue that keeps a team together, the water cooler talk, does not happen organically on there. So as a leader, you have to do things that are pragmatic in order to foster that, I like to call it, horizontal engagement within an organization. So that means having things such as happy hours on there. As an introvert, those are scary to me, but you basically have happy hours and people can talk with each other. If you ever do a happy hour, just remember that you don't just turn on a Zoom camera and say, hey, talk to each other. Warm up, exercise, playing charades, something to kind of get people talking with each other is a great way of kicking things off, because if you first start doing that, naturally people will just be like, what are we doing this for? What's the point? And if you set the tone in the meeting with some sort of interactive activity, people will start to open up, and then you'll start fostering those relationships on there. And that's what really can drive engagement and also retention in a company.
You know, we all now have such diverse workforces, and you wrote about your parents' success in hiring a diverse workforce without making a conscious decision, like many companies today hire even diversity managers. How did this impact your thinking about the concept of diversity?
Yeah, it's funny you picked up on that, because that's a very it's a very controversial thing to say in this time and age. So the way it made me think about it is that I realized that there is an interview process, and if someone scores well enough in the interview process, they'll get the job on there. And I became very frustrated a lot with corporate America, because there's this huge push for, say, diversity. But the weird part is it's not necessarily diversity. It's more of the context of, if it doesn't necessarily meet some sort of quota or standard, there must be an inherent problem in it. And I remember I had this interesting conversation with someone about that, who was very, having diversity, et cetera. And she was in charge of this woman's leadership group. And I said, hey, this is what I'm doing in my company. And I told her, I have 90% women in my staff. She's like, oh, that's amazing. And I held myself back for a second. I thought, well, wait a minute. According to certain things in diversity, I must have like an equal quota of like the general population to my company, but I'm breaking that in a way. And I thought, you know what, there's going to always be some sort of imbalance in some sense. And if you are an employer and you stick to your guns in terms of how you hire, making sure that the interview process is standardized and there's a certain bar or quality in there, and people go through the same process and they score better, it doesn't matter what background they have. They can do the job according to the criteria you set forth on there. If it doesn't match some sort of standard that people have out there, that's outside. But in terms of the company, and I realized this running my own, I got to make sure whoever walks into the company and is on payroll is like, they can get the job done. I can't take that risk on there, but I need to make sure that that's the case. And it turned out that it was 90% women. Why? I don't know. I put the job ads out there and it just was mainly female applicants. So chances I'll get mainly female applicants or employees for the role on there. And I don't see anything wrong with that as much as if someone comes by and says, oh, you must be sexist. It's like, no, because the applicant pool is actually this way and they scored well and that's how it turned out.
Yeah, I faced the same thing in the early 90s. I ran a large trade association, and it was essentially me, and then we did eventually get a guy on, but it was me and 23 women. And the
Yeah.
women were dying for me to hire more men, just for they felt it was like
I
too many women in one workplace working together. And so, but I was all these organizations were saying, "Oh my God, it's so great you hire so many women," but it just turned out that they really fit the type of business better. And we had a hard time finding guys who were good for this type of business, which required a lot of attention to detail. And so guys we did hire just didn't make it in that environment, but the women did thrived in it.
Mhm.
In your book, you mentioned, you talk about Peter Drucker. Is management guru Peter Drucker right when he states business's job is marketing and innovation in 2021? And how does that fit with Drucker's vision of a workplace where people value authenticity? Because one part sounds cold and impersonal, and the other sounds more touchy-feely.
I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think based off of the certain circumstances today, the actual management style will change. Remember, he said two fundamental things. One is the innovation, right? How a company is creating new ways of solving today's problems or whatever the current day problems are, right? And the second part is the marketing, which is its ability to acquire new customers and provide more value to the environment of which they're in on there. The aspect of innovation within that umbrella or that box, there's the aspect of management, and the management styles could change based off the current times. And if you have people who can easily leave the company, that's going to leave different pressures on how people actually manage people internally on there. So I don't necessarily think that they're mutually exclusive and one's cold and one's hard, or one's cold and the other one's warm on there. I think it's a very basic way of boiling down business, but it's a very true and accurate way of perceiving it.
Is transparency of a company's future plans and financials important as being authentic?
It depends on who you ask on there. I sit down with my team and I with the leadership and I say, hey, here's where we have to go, 1, 2, and 3. I don't necessarily show people the bank account on there. I don't agree with that. I know some companies that do that. I don't think that's what the employees need to know, because there's a few different dangerous things to that. Because if you show everyone the money in the bank account and someone in there is not earning nearly as much as they would like, they would probably argue, well, there's a lot of money in there. Why am I not earning that money? Well, it could be out. The reality could be everyone in that position is earning that same salary on there. And sometimes you need money in the bank account in order to survive a rainy day like COVID. So
Yeah, sure, of course.
and I realize that in certain roles, and when you run your own company, when you are an employee, it changes the way that you perceive how things are run on there. And when you're an employee, you may think that someone's holding me down, but then once you're the business owner, it's like, how can you help someone with career growth if the company's not growing? It's like, I don't know what to do. So it could feel like you're being held down. So in the aspect of showcasing the financials, I think they're important on there, but I think there's a level of discretion that someone needs to use based off of the industry that they're in. Because when someone sees X dollars, they might not perceive it the same way as, let's say, a CEO versus an entry-level employee on there.
I found that I ran a few turnarounds and wrote a book on it. And I found that the more I told them, especially in the beginning, the more they trusted me. And it got to the point that they wanted me to stop giving them so much information.
Interesting.
And so they said, oh, now after 3 months, we trust you totally. You only need to tell us what you actually think we need to know. We don't need to know all the financials. We don't need to know all of the plans. Just tell us what we need to know and tell us what we need to do to execute on it. So I got their total trust from being honest, but I didn't tell them what other people were making. I say, you get to know everything, but not what your colleagues are making or what I'm making.
That can get you in big trouble because I've had a few times when I let employees know, oh gosh, like the just fighting immediately. It's like I'm not perfect, okay, but because someone gets a bigger commission than you on certain things, it's like, okay, come on, like, but yeah, it's difficult. It's not that simple because in your case, you found it to be very successful to let them know how much is going on in the business financials on there.
I also
But
think that there's a certain amount of authenticity here. We just talk about employees, but even the vendors you deal with. So, when I did these turnarounds, I would bring all the vendors we had money in and show them everything, totally open about everything that we were doing. Here's the financials, here's our plans, here's how we're going to make
mhm,
money, here's how we're going to get you back your money, and here's how we're even going to help you make more money. It ended up that we had in this one company 5 lawsuits dropped because we were so open about all the information. And it turned out that those guys started helping us get new clients. And so there was a level of trust built up by being that open with everyone.
yeah, glad
How
that
do you,
worked well for you.
what's that?
I said I'm glad that worked well for you on there.
Yeah, and I found that worked well each time I did these turnarounds. How do companies use social media to present themselves, their products and services as authentic? And is that really authentic? Because it seems so staged to me.
Well, that's typically corporate world comes off as staged. And if you go onto YouTube and you search cat videos, how much production work do they put into those cat videos? Right? But they show it up well. But there's an important point here. When you I always in my presentations I always talk about that there's an inverse relationship between production value and authenticity. If you have a super high production value, it's very hard to convey the level of authenticity versus I'm a Twitch streamer and someone can see what my cat's doing next to me and I'm eating a bagel, right? And I look awful. It's like it shows this dimension in there that in the corporate world is very missed. So what I often say to corporations for if they have job ads or they're trying to create employee videos to say, hey, I work at this company, you should join, is you sometimes just need just this, like, and you record a video that comes off as more um, real on there. Because why? Well, if you go onto YouTube, the vast majority of content that you're seeing is actually recorded with this. So if you have someone who's younger and they're used to seeing videos are made through this, and then you have a corporate video where they spent 20 grand on this promotional piece, it's going to come off very differently on there. And they have to have the script right and the person's makeup this way. It's like, that's not real.
Yeah,
And people can spot that immediately now because you can create videos with this on there. And, yeah.
and this is, I thought was interesting. You read about several recruiting videos from Zappos and Google. How can videos, which are edited and staged, which we're talking about now, make a company come across as authentic? I would imagine the only way video works is to have live people watch as people go through their day, have cameras around the office area or whatever you're trying to show to convince people that this is a great place to work.
I mean, not to dive into details of video production on there, but I would just say generally I would stay away from trying to go with super high production value work on there. And it depends on the goal of the video. Let's say your goal of the video is for people to get an idea of how it's like to work there. You can roll up maybe in a nice little 4K camera that costs you $200 and literally walk through the office and say, here's Sally, da, 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 da. Sally, what are you working on? Blah, blah, blah. Like, and literally take an actual clip of that. There's a lot of CEOs now on the social media sphere that do that on there that I'm not a huge fan. If someone's heard of Grant Cardone, if you type in Grant Cardone and just see some of his videos, occasionally he goes through his company and it's an organic experience because someone's trying to talk to him about something. He's like, hey, I'm shooting a video, right? And you can see beyond the stage atmosphere and get a feel for what it's like working there. But it's that sort of general like change in the way of advertising how a company works internally that you can really start to convey a level of authenticity on there. I don't necessarily think it has to be a live performance. In fact, I don't think many live performances are authentic on there.
I agree with you. And some companies, what you're doing is kind of boring, and it's hard to come across as anything more than that to excite people about what you're doing and why they should come and work at your particular company. And I think more people read social media and see what people say about the companies they work for, which drives a lot of reason why people want to go to work for someone or an organization. You talk in the book about a story about a leader who tried to come across as authentic, but as time went along, he proved to be a fraud. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can't recall from my memory the exact story that I used on there, but there's quite a few. Well, we can look through any downfall of a politician has that exact arc, right? Promises made, ends up time goes on, promises are broken on there. The Cindio leader who told everyone that they were authentic and they're a charismatic leader and extroverted on there, but then they made one promise and it was false. I mean, that's a break in authenticity. And one just rule of thumb I use is, hey, if someone asks you a question that's going to make you lie, don't answer the question or be honest on there, because then you don't have to worry about whether or not you lied.
In the authentic leadership area, who in the public eye is a good example of this? And it can be sports, it can be anything.
This is a weird question, because I think that in the current world that we're in, the level of technology that's involved in our lives makes us inauthentic. For instance, I can't have locker room talk with you on this, because if this gets uploaded and put on there, they're like, oh, Jeff said this. It's like, yes, people say that sometimes before a closed door that, oh, so and so is a loser. Yes, we did say that on there. And I think in the world of social media, there's also this cancel culture on there that I think, especially for places like comedy, that usually are willing to explore subjects that most people are not, in sort of a way that can make people think differently about them, is put on the guillotine for that sense, because everyone's sort of held to this permanent line that everything you say is on a permanent basis. Because right now we think like social media is great, the smartphones and everything, but imagine if you're like a 9-year-old kid and you like throw up in the middle of third grade class and everyone laughs. That goes on social media. And if you're in high school or college and then someone says, oh, I wonder what Jim Brown did when he was growing up, and that's like 15 million views, that's stuck. That's a permanent timeline on there. And that for me is absolutely scary, because I haven't been perfect. I've made tons of mistakes on there. I'm sure, Marc, you've experienced the same. So when we look at authenticity and the level of media, sports, and leadership on there, I think it's interesting because it holds people to a much higher standard on there. But I don't think as a society we're ready to see that most people who we consider our heroes are not perfect. And we're not necessarily willing to forgive people for mistakes. That is because even with social media, like let's say you make a mistake on there, social media can magnify that 20, 50, 100 times bigger than the mistake itself. Like you have people who are apologizing for saying, like, calling someone a bad name on there, and it completely destroys someone's career. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like I know there's one individual who sent out a horrible tweet when she went to Africa, making this joke about AIDS and people from Africa. And
I forget who that was.
Yeah. Okay. She lost her entire career for that. But let's just break it down for a second here. It was a messed up thing to say, but it was a tweet. It's a tweet. She probably worked years to get to that point on there. She will probably never be able to get a job again that can support her, unless she's going to maybe work McDonald's. I don't know. Some place doesn't check that, but that's permanent. That's tough. And you know what? When I'm tired, I'll say something silly that I would later regret on there. And it's tough to have that just like, all right, permanent, boom, that's it. I'm like, dang, that's tough.
Well, that's because everything is instantaneous. I mean, back in the day, before this, in Hollywood, PR people would control everything and make sure that you weren't embarrassed, and those pictures didn't come out about you. And same with sports. Everything would be well-crafted images. But now it's impossible to, you have the tools to craft the image, but people are watching you every second of every day. You go and eat dinner at a Chinese restaurant and you had a bad day, and you say, yell at the waiter, and it's not about him, it's about the bad day. And now everybody thinks you're a total jerk.
Yeah, that you're out of control, anger management. They should be thrown in prison because they now beat children when they're. It's like, oh my god, like, and that's. I don't think we're necessarily understand that as a society. I don't think I really understand it. Like, what is the line on that we really draw? Like, I think maybe the way you're going with that question is saying, well, we can now see a new dimension of the leaders that are out there with sports and stuff. I would agree, but I also think that there's a consequence to that we don't fully understand because this video, when it goes online, guess what? It's going to be there for 50 years later.
Oh
I'm going to
yeah.
look back like in a wheelchair, just being like, oh, I remember that. Like, that's 50 years. That's a long time on
Oh,
there. I don't know
100%.
what that means.
Absolutely. Um, is it smart for leaders to show vulnerability, or will that shake the confidence of employees?
I show vulnerability. I see that it depends on how you do it. I know some CEOs that go or leaders that are just like, oh, I'm so sad, like, and just cry. It's like, whoa, like that's a little bit of a lot. But I think it goes yes and no. I think there's ways of being vulnerable that people can really relate to on there. Like when I had to help my team get through COVID, and I had to say, hey, we lost 70% of our revenue on there, right? And I could say, hey, I have trouble sleeping at night, but I would say, you know what? I'm going to damn make sure we get through this. Like you can have that, you can provide that, but if you still show strength in the same context, I think it can work as a very valuable tool.
I think Dick Vermeil, who was a famous football coach, coached the Eagles, and he took the Rams to the Super Bowl, and they won in Kansas City, and they were successful. Was known for crying at press conferences, just break down in tears. The first time was pretty shocking to people, but then they got kind of used to it that he was such an emotional guy, and it worked to his favor. People thought he was very authentic. They trusted everything he said. And it gave him a nice long coaching career, along with a great career in being a broadcaster. There's an interesting story in the book about a man named Gage who had his personality change from a construction accident.
Right.
He reminds me of someone with Asperger's. I think of people with Asperger's as very authentic because they don't have much of a filter, which can also work against them. How can someone with little to no filter prevent themselves from being discriminated against for being maybe too authentic?
I think you can't, because you're basically saying the fundamental tool of being able to read someone else is impaired on there. And that's what we can read social cues, engage a conversation, and how someone's reacting from there. And I think if that's compromised, it's going to be impossible for them to be able to operate in a similar way with someone who does not have that compromised on there. But to elaborate on the story, basically this guy's working in construction, and he puts dynamite into a hole, and the pike shoots out, 3 long pike, and it shoots up through his head and takes out a part of his brain that basically makes him a lot more volatile, but also removes his ability to have some sort of discipline, control, restraint. So they said fundamentally his personality changed from the blast that the pike through his head. But I was pointing out in that book that I thought it was quite humorous that people thought that that's a true definition of authenticity, because it's what he thinks. He doesn't hold back, but no one wanted to be around him. So it's like, do you really want to be who you are on there? Like if I get grumpy, should I go in the other room and say to my girlfriend, oh, how dare you, for weird stuff? No, I have to hold back. I have to really constrict that a bit, because I have to realize where I'm at on there. And I don't think you can really, I think you're out of luck if you have those issues on there. I think there's certain things you can do, but honestly, I don't have enough training in terms of, Asperger's or people with Tourette's to really know what sort of things they can do.
Well, I was also thinking of, as a leader, how you manage that so those people can participate in the workforce as well, and how you manage their type of authenticity.
That people who are just more generally themselves on there and don't really hold back at all.
Yeah, I mean, they're like, especially people who may not be able to help it, but they could be great contributors to the company, but they are who they are, and in some cases they don't have control over that lack of filter, and they don't think about it or how to position themselves in a different way. They just come out and say what's on their minds. because just as who they are. So how does an organization absorb that and allow them to be part of a team there?
If that individual who's struggling and the organization can come to some sort of expectations and agreement of what needs to be done and stick to that, let's say they show up and they put together 5 notebooks for a day and they can do that, fantastic. And they can work within that scope of operations, great. I do think you can utilize people in a workplace environment if you're able to, if both parties can come to an agreement of what's required for the exchange of money and service on there, whether or not they have those issues. But if someone does have that, chances are you don't want to put them in customer service, right? It's
Yeah.
that's my main point on there, is that you can put someone into the right place, but both parties have to be in agreement of what's required of each side.
Have you watched the movie Social Dilemma, and how does cancel culture limits our ability to be authentic?
I have watched half of Social Dilemma on there, and I think I was a little ahead of the curve because I gave a whole a TED talk about smartphones uh, long back in 2016 about that same exact topic, because I was like, yes, they're recording all your data. You go onto Facebook, those pictures that you're sending of yourself with your shirt off, yes, those go to 30 different places and they're probably sold in some, yeah, I knew all that. In terms of cancel culture, I think cancel culture is a very dangerous thing on there, because you start to get more in a context where you're watching every single little thing that you say. And the weird part about it is the economy that it works within. A cancel culture works in the atmosphere of playing victimhood on there, that someone is a victim and someone's an oppressor on there. And people are rewarded for hunting and finding the so-called oppressor on there. And the context of the game is quite scary because you work on an infinite timeline. The timeline goes on forever. So if you can find one thing wrong with someone, you've hunted them. And if you found them, you win then the credibility prize of showing that this one person made a mistake on there. But as we all know, behind closed doors, we make mistakes. And everyone says stupid things. Everyone does that. But the bigger question is, can someone move forward in their life in a productive way and learn from their mistakes on there? And I wouldn't agree with all things that happen on cancel culture. I think I'm very against it because I believe in people that can learn from their mistakes in life. I think the biggest issue that happens in it, especially in terms of authenticity, is that the same area that people are trying to hunt for each other, they end up eating themselves on there. Because if you're trying to find that one person out there who made that mistake, that celebrity or that individual, someone can find you, do the same thing to you on there. So then you start living in this like walking on the eggshells all the time. If you ever had a really like a crazy relative, and if you leave one thing out on the kitchen counter, it's a crumb, and they come after you, it's a horrible experience on there. So I think it does a lot of it really throws a wrench into the system of exploring ideas freely on there. And I think with the ability to explore free ideas, you sometimes make mistakes. And unfortunately, where we all make mistakes, and the game that's set up, I don't think is a long-lasting game that's going to do us as a society well.
Yeah, and people are no longer allowed to apologize. People get canceled right away without anybody saying, let's give them a second chance. So
Yeah.
is there any one last piece of advice, as we have like a minute left, any one last piece of advice for building an authentic culture and work environment that you would give the audience?
I would think writing down what you see as the ideal vision of how that culture is created. What would it really be inside of the company on there? And then sitting back and really thinking which leaders are in the company and how do they operate, and seeing the difference between your vision of that environment and how those leaders operate. And what you'll find very often is that if you write those values together, you find that the leaders and the environment itself, the culture, is organic. And if the leaders are different than the culture, that vision will not be met on there. But if they are the same, you find that authentic culture actually exists.
Jeff, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us. I really enjoyed your book. I think from the comments here, people really enjoyed your talk about how to be authentic and took away a lot of good information. I hope your new year starts off great, and I hope everybody who's joined us that their holidays were great and their 2021 is even greater, and it's got to be better than we've experienced in 2020, we all hope. So look forward to seeing you all next Friday for our next guest. Hope everybody has a great and safe weekend. Again, Jeff, thanks, and we look forward to when you do another book.
All right. Appreciate it, Marc.
Bye, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, everybody.